Hello, this is going to be 5 minutes at 200 literary. It's about the Loch Ness Monster for literary practice. 200 words a minute, ready? Most people think that the Loch Ness Monster first appeared in the 1930s, and it is certainly from this time that Nessie became famous, but sightings of something unusual in the loch date back much further than this. It is said that the residents around the loch used to tell their children stories of the Kelpie to keep them away from the dark, dangerous waters of the loch. The story was of a fearsome beast who lived in the loch, and when hungry would leave its watery home and transform itself into a beautiful horse, which would wait for some unlucky traveler to climb on its back. Then it would gallop straight into the loch and feed on its victim. I can see how this would discourage children from playing near the loch, but it never stopped the locals from fishing the loch for salmon. The first recorded sighting of the creature dates back to 565 by Saint Columba. The saint was an Irish priest who was touring the Highlands teaching Christianity. One day, while traveling along the side of the loch, he came upon a group of locals burying one of their friends who had swum out into the loch to retrieve a boat that had come loose from its moorings and had been savaged by the great beast. Columba asked one of his followers to swim out and retrieve the boat, and when he did, the beast rose from the loch with a mighty roar and went to attack the man. At this point, Saint Columba held up his cross and shouted, "Stop! Go thou no further, nor touch the man." Upon hearing this, the beast returned to the depth of the loch, seemingly never to roar again. Next, we jump to around 1650. At this time, the English army was trying to gain more control over the Highland clans, and to help with this, a large ship was built at Inverness, then moved to the loch using rollers. The idea of the ship was to transport supplies and men around the loch to quell any trouble before it became serious. On board the ship was a writer called Richard Frank, who was part of Oliver Cromwell's, Lord Protector of England's, army. He wrote about the famous Loch Ness, well known for its floating islands. Frank explained the floating islands as mats of vegetation floating around the loch, but because of the peat content in the water, very little vegetation grows near its shores, as the sunlight can only penetrate a few feet below the surface. Other reports of strange things seen in the loch can be found from the 18th and 19th centuries, but it was 1933 which heralded the start of the Loch Ness Monster as we know it. In April of 1933, Mr. and Mrs. Mackay were driving down the loch side from Inverness to their home when Mrs. Mackay saw a disturbance in the loch which she, at first, thought was ducks fighting. But as she watched, she saw a large beast in the middle of the loch rolling and plunging in the water, causing a great disturbance. The sighting was reported to Alex Campbell, a local gamekeeper and a reporter for the Inverness Courier. Campbell claims to have seen the monster on no less than 18 occasions. The story appeared in the paper on the 2nd of May 1933, and the Loch Ness Monster as we know it today was born. The first picture taken, which claims to show the Loch Ness Monster, was taken on the 12th of November 1933 by Mr. Hugh Gray. Mr. Gray was returning from church and was walking near to where the River Foyers meets the loch. He saw an object of considerable dimension rise out of the flat, calm waters of the loch to what he estimated was a height of about 3 feet. He immediately got his camera ready to look for a series of photos before the loch had returned to being flat calm again. Mr. Gray thought he had missed anything of interest, so the film stayed in the camera for the next 3 weeks until his brother had it developed, but only one of the pictures came out, and this is now one of the classic pictures of the Loch Ness Monster. The picture had been studied by 4 photographic experts, and all have found it to be without trace of tampering. Dr. Maurice Burton, a zoologist, believed it to show an otter in the act of diving, but F.W. Holliday, a well-known fishing writer, thought it was some kind of a giant marine worm. Interest in the monster soared, so the Daily Mail newspaper decided to send a team to the loch to look for evidence. It was headed by Marmaduke Wetherall, a famous big-game hunter, who turned up at the Lochland, hired a boat to search for the beast. He intended to use his tracking skills to hunt the monster to its lair. Daily reports appeared in the paper, and after only 2 days at the loch, the headline shouted the story of Wetherall's find of footprints on the shore of the loch. Plaster casts were taken and sent to the British Museum of Natural History to be examined. The footprints were soon discovered to have been made by a stuffed hippopotamus foot, so with heads bowed low, the Daily Mail left the loch to find other news stories with which to tempt its readers. The next big event at the Loch, and probably the one which has had the most impact over the last 66 years, is the photo taken by Robert Kenneth Wilson on the 19th of April 1934. Better known as the surgeon's photo, it must be one of the most easily recognizable photos in the world. Wilson and a friend were in the Highlands wild fowl shooting, and when traveling down the side of the loch, pulled their car over to stretch their legs. As they stood looking at the loch, they noticed a considerable commotion on the surface about 200 yards away. And as they watched, they saw something break the surface, and his friend shouted, "My God, it's the monster." Okay, good luck.